Jonathan, thank you so much. And you bring in a good perspective that sometimes things are not clear. There are a lot of times that Scripture seems to say that it should be clear. You know, that Psalm 119, Psalm 19, 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 that do indicate that Scripture should provide guidance and be clear to us, and even in providing some stability and some solidness. And, that would just be something I think provide a good corrective. We're thinking that we can and should get it all figured out, but I think there's some things that we can trust.
Yeah, I would never by any means say that there aren't things that we in Scripture that are clear or that we can't know. But it's interesting for me, even like how the movement of Scripture works. If you were to think about it developmentally, like in the same way that you think about how, and this is probably an important thing to say, just thinking about stages of faith. If you think about how a child grows, in adolescence and all those kinds of things, it's really interesting how the text of Scripture expands. I mean, I think like if you're starting just with the law is so like foundational. The law to me, like, this sounds so crude, but I think often what you get in the law is a sense of like someone says to their kid, like, don't touch the hot stove, whatever you do, don't touch the hot stove. We're trying to get you not to touch the hot stove. It's like this very, like that's kind of the first level of consciousness that we get there. But the more Scripture expands, then you've got through the prophets, and then you've got through the history books, all those kinds of things. There's all this dialogue and the traditions expanding and talking to each other. There's all these things that are kind of unfolding as it goes. So I do think, some of these things are very different depending on what stage of faith that you're in. I mean, like when a person's first coming into a relationship with Jesus, the idea, I don't think would be like hit them over the head with all the ambiguity within the text and those things. But people do need, some clear handles. But at the same time, I still think like using that Genesis text as kind of a guiding principle. One of the things I love most about it is that when Jacob first gets in this wrestling match, he really doesn't know exactly who or what he's wrestling with. But there's this idea that by the end, that God has revealed in that and through that. And I think there's just something in that, for me at least, just a beautiful image of how Scripture works. It often feels like we're kind of getting jumped in the middle of the night. And we are struggling with these tensions. We are being challenged. And I think it really is through, the morning comes, there is daylight ultimately, but it's just, if it is through the wrestling that God transforms and through the wrestling that God changes, So let me put it like this maybe. It's not like ambiguity for ambiguity's sake. It's a kind of ambiguity and tension that pushes us deeper into the mystery of God, which always transforms us. So I think it's like it's a constructive work. It's not just this idea of like, let's deconstruct everything, let's question everything for the sake of like whatever. If we're, I think, prayerful and open to what God's doing by His Spirit, ultimately this is what transforms us into the likeness of Jesus. This is how God changes us, is through that wrestling. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that for me at least has become a great way of thinking about how the text works, is that there is a kind of clarity that comes, but you can't skip through the dark night. Sometimes I'll wrestle with this too, because I really am just riffing here right now. I guess that's clear. But I find so often kind of talking to folks, like sometimes I just think that we want to kind of skip ahead to some sort of like bottom line kind of conclusions that really sometimes just don't work unless you kind of have your own process of kind of wrestling with things and like going through that journey. You can't fast forward through it. So I don't know, here's a simple way that I like to think about this in terms of preaching and teaching. One of the practices I try to start to develop more, kind of within the pulpit, just within my own world, is like this. Whatever text I was preaching on, it used to be such a temptation for me to want to over-explain it in a way like if there's something in that text that I find to be a little bit messy, then I'm trying to then like put it in this huge context and like whatever. I try to increasingly come to a place where whatever text I would be preaching from that week, just let that text say what it says. And then when I'm preaching from another text the next week, let's deal with what that text is really saying, instead of trying to solve all that. So let's use the example of Proverbs and Job. Talk about the Proverbs, and let's deal with what's here in the Proverbs. And when we're in Job, let's deal with what's really there. And if that message isn't easily synthesized, I don't think it's our job to always like sort that within the same space, but to kind of let them both. Another example might be, for example, the relationship between James and Paul in terms of the role of works. It's not that I don't think those things are complementary, but they're not easily solved. And so I think, like, if you're talking about what James says about the role of works, and you're talking about what Paul says, well, yeah, probably not going to figure that out in a 30-minute sermon. I think that's okay. Let's deal with James here, and let's deal with Paul in a really authentic way. And I think, entrusting that the Spirit will work kind of in the intersection between those things. So sometimes for me, like, I go back to Chris Thomas's thing all the time about the way that Scripture works, like a black gospel choir. Like, through all these, Chris likes to use the example of how, like, a certain kind of, like, liturgical white choir, everybody's singing the same notes, and it's all very, whatever. But how, like, in a great black gospel choir, that you have all these dissonant notes. And if you took one of those notes in isolation, something might seem like it's off pitch, off key, whatever, but when those voices come and they blend, the unity that comes through that diversity is so beautiful. It just like stirs your soul. The way Chris would talk about this is that too often we end up trying to flatten out the voices in the choir. We want all the voices in the canon to sing the same note on the same key, and that's not what really happens. The beauty comes through the diversity. We let those voices blend. Am I doing justice to Chris's illustration?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I'd like to just say a few things, partially because I invited Jonathan to come, and I have the microphone. In Pentecostal circles, when you have the microphone, you're done. So, one thing I'd say is I love, Jonathan, to hear you speak. Because when I hear you, the passage of Scripture that comes to mind, and this happens when I hear Chris Green, who's a friend of yours, speak too, is, man, this is not like the Pharisees. This is a new teaching with authority. And in a little book that the CCU students read called College in the Spirit, which was co-authored by Paul Carter, right here, raise your hand, Paul, just in case those of you that are in the class didn't realize you're reading him. In that book, it's getting at this, one of the things that it gets at is this issue that being a person of faith is not the same as just being a person who thinks certain things. That what it means to be a human being is not just to think, but it's also to feel, to believe, and to act, and to have passions and affections. And I think in a lot of ways, sometimes in not necessarily in college settings, but sometimes in college settings too, but a lot of times in church settings, we kind of reduce what it means to be Christian to just think certain things. So the way we practice it is, there's a preacher, and that's the main point, right? That's the sermon. So the old church's emphasis on the table, the Eucharist, or the Pentecostal emphasis on the altar, it kind of gets moved away a little bit. We're all just about what this person's saying. We're all looking the same way, and we're kind of nodding our heads, yeah, that's right, I believe. And it doesn't affect us enough, I think, about the way we live. So I don't think there's any teenagers these days getting pregnant because they don't know what causes pregnancy. Like, oh, I shouldn't have drunk that last night. Well, no, that didn't make you pregnant. There's something else that made you pregnant. They know what it is. It's not a lack of education, but their hearts and souls and bodies haven't been fully engaged. They're not all in. And your very kind of Pentecostal way of saying, maybe Scripture is not just like the instruction manual for the bookshelf that you bought at IKEA. Really simple, really straightforward. Maybe it's as provocative and inviting as your grandmother's or your pastor's or your mother's stories they told you, conversations that they told you about, that kind of invite you in and require you to wrestle with it. And this question, and it's a question because that I've heard a lot, Matt, your initial question, although phrased much nicer when you said it than sometimes when I've gotten it. So the question is, well, if Scripture isn't simple, well then, what if we get it wrong? That's the scary part, right? And so I think your word, spirit, and community is a good answer. And now to my question it seems to me that Alistair, so that was just a comment. That wasn't, if you thought there was a question in there, there wasn't. I like what you say about riffing. If he was like a jazz guy, and he was like doing that on his clarinet, I just grabbed my trumpet and I was going to riff something too. Yeah, so if...
Jazz music is very compelling.
It is, yeah. A lot of improvisation, get it out. So the tradition, I think, which I don't think you spoke to as much. I think the tradition is one of the things that helps us, right? So we're not getting way out there in left field. But I think, to quote Alistair McIntyre, there's a difference between like a living tradition and a dead tradition. And the dead tradition is that one which you can't change at all. And the living tradition is the one that's still open to some change. And I'll say I realize I'm not trying to make you all Pentecostals tonight. But you might have heard that Southeastern is affiliated with a Pentecostal denomination. So again, I'm not laying hands on you, not trying to make it speak in tongues, but I feel comfortable talking about my Pentecostal heritage and the Pentecostal heritage of this institution, right? So as Pentecostals, we are pioneers, right? If our forefathers and foremothers thought the only way forward was to reaffirm exactly what they had been taught, then they would have never started things like what we call the Assemblies of God, the Church of God in Christ, the Church of God. And so part of being faithful to them and being a living tradition is kind of opening up, I think, to this kind of wrestling. So for you, how much has tradition, or how much does tradition play a role in Scripture interpretation and Scripture application?
Oh, that's such a great question. By the way, it was funny when you were setting that up about the Pentecostal component, and you said, I don't know how many you heard, and it's kind of like, I really felt like it was going to